Hey, this is Christian Roldan.
And Jordan Morris from the Seattle Sounders Football Club.
And you're listening to...
This is Nos Odietis. This episode of Nos Odietis is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Odietis since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
A sideline fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Ruidíaz through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nicola leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders is going to
They've scored! They've scored! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
Is that what you young people call twerking?
That Porter says cheated.
You want to win? This is the Seattle Sounders, bro.
Welcome back to another episode of Nos Odietis, sponsored by Full Pull Wines. Today is January 12th, and this is the first episode of 2024, and we're breaking out the mailbag for you. We're putting this one in front of the paywall, just to give you a heads up. Usually our mailbags are reserved for our paid subscribers, but, you know, we're starting off 2024, give you a little taste. And joining me today is Tim Foss. I'll give you. You want to say hi, Tim?
Hey, how's it going? Happy to be on the mailbag episode.
Yeah, we don't. This is this is a treat for everyone. Aaron and I were planning on recording this week, but I was supposed to go to MLS Media Day in Miami, but doors started falling off Alaska. I guess not. I guess Boeing planes. I don't want to blame Alaska, but they canceled my flight, and so I stayed here, and our schedules got all jammed up, and so Aaron and I aren't recording, but Tim is filling in. So I want to say thank you, Tim. You probably know Tim. He's apparent. He's been on the podcast before, but he is all over Sounder at Heart. So thank you, Tim. I think you're going to be doing a great job today. Before we get into the questions, though, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Literally, as we were pressing record, the Sounders announced that they had signed Jonathan Bell. You may remember him as the player they picked in the second stage of the reentry draft, someone that they say will give them a little bit more versatility on defense. Earlier this week, they announced that they had signed Nathan. He's a Brazilian center back who was last at the Earthquakes. Earlier today, they announced that they had signed Raúl Ruidíaz. He's getting promoted from Tacoma Defiance after setting a franchise record with 17 goals. These are all things that you probably thought had already happened because Sounder at Heart reported them as being done, weeks ago in some cases. The other big thing that we are sort of waiting, or actually I take it back. The other announcement that came earlier this week, and probably the most impactful actual signing they have announced, was Josh Atencio getting an extension that guarantees him through 2027 with an option for 28. My understanding is that they're planning on making him a U22 initiative player. That means that virtually whatever his salary is, he'll only hit the cap at about $200,000. So that's a potentially big move for a player that is expected to be a starter. And then the other sort of things that are flying around just out in the ether, just to get you all caught up, is Pedro de la Vega. He's the young DP the Sounders are, best I can tell, have already signed. They just haven't announced it yet. I would expect that to happen next week. That's a big one. And then there's also this rumor that Fluminense, of all teams, the big Brazilian team, is interested in signing Leo Chu, and they asked the Sounders what it would cost, and supposedly the Sounders told them, we want $5 million. Tim, let's start with, before we get into the questions, I don't think anyone asked about Chu, so let's start there. I don't know. Do you have any reactions to any of this stuff that's been going on?
I mean, I think a Chu to Brazil move makes a lot of sense. From his perspective, it does seem like most of the rumors and reports have originated from his agents, his camp.
Yeah.
He had a child with his partner last year. I personally don't have kids, but I am aware that raising them with a support network around you makes
It does
raising
make
them much easier.
It does. Yeah, I can attest to that.
His family is in Brazil. It would make sense for those personal sort of reasons. I also imagine a young Brazilian guy who started his career in Brazil probably wants to be able to, like, now that he's taken his career to, another level, would like to be able to prove himself a little bit more back at home. For it to make sense from a Sounders perspective, yeah, that $5 million figure is probably around what they're gonna need to make it worthwhile for them. I think it's definitely an interesting thing to watch over the next couple weeks. I don't know how long it's.
Yeah, I would think
Pedro
that's
de la Vega saga has taught us that expecting anything to move quickly is,
naive.
maybe unreasonable.
Yeah, it was funny. I went back and looked at my Pedro de la Vega reporting, and it was like almost 6 weeks ago where the report we had was that they were finalizing the deal. So you can take that there had been a lot of work that had gone into it up until that point, and I don't know all what's going on behind the scenes, but it seems like there were some twists and turns. Some other teams sort of came in and were potentially interested in bringing De La Vega, but it looks like that one's going to get over the line. But yeah, the Chu one's interesting. I could see for sure the appeal. I mean, going back to Rio de Janeiro, sort of as in a very different place. Like when he came from Grêmio, it was, here's this kid who hasn't really played, who's not really he was a little bit of a late bloomer by Brazilian standards, if I remember correctly. And he like never even played in front of crowds because his entire professional career had basically been played during the COVID pandemic, or the height of the COVID pandemic. And for him to go back, I will say he's integrated himself well. He's learned English. His English is actually really impressive. I don't think he spoke almost any English at all when he got here, and now he's reasonably fluent. But he would go back to Brazil a very different player, a much more confident player, someone who sort of is can feel like he can hang in the top flight. So if that happens, I think it's great. But I will caution that the Sounders probably need, like, he's still a useful player to the Sounders. There's no reason the Sounders should be looking to just sort of dump his salary and bring in, unless they have another sort of U22 player that they have just ready to sign. It would be maybe a slight disservice to sell him for anything less than $5 million, because at $5 million, they would get, by my estimations, they'd probably get about $1 million in general allocation money. And that's like a material benefit. Now, if you sell them for $4 million, you still recoup all your investment, but you don't really have any GAM. You can go out and re-spend that $4 million, which is nice. But you can't really fix your you can't really do anything to fix your roster, to help your roster. So you need to be sort of convinced, at least from my perspective, the Sounders need to be convinced that it's worth making the sale. The other thing I'd caution about the Fluminense rumor is they don't buy players. They sell a lot of players, a lot of expensive players. They routinely sell players for $10 million, $20 million. So they might have money, but they are not normally in the business of buying a Leo Chu type of player. You have to go back to like 2017 to find the last time they even spent like $3.5 million, let alone they don't spend $5 million on players. I think they've done it once at least according to the transfer market, they've done it once. So it would be a little weird for them to sort of like break the bank for Leo Chu, but I don't know, maybe it's a different world now for them.
Yeah, the one other thing I would add there is they seemed from the reports like they were pursuing or maybe they were a little bit farther in pursuing, I think, Luis Enrique, who I think plays for Betis in Spain, and stopped pursuing him and transferred their focus to Chu for sort of the same position. They don't really they have one guy who plays that spot currently on the squad. It's a position they need to fill. The fact that they seemingly were told $5 million from the Sounders and they didn't pull out at that point.
Right.
Maybe with the fact that they do sell players, there is a persuasive argument that they can make for, a smaller initial fee and meaningful sell-on clause. But again, that's a gamble for the Sounders to take if they don't have someone effectively lined up to fill a U22 spot.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. I guess it could if it gets to the point where Leo Chu is sort of demanding to be transferred, I suppose that maybe changes the equation a little bit. But nothing I've seen is suggesting that we're at that point yet. This is still, teams asking questions and getting the answers and taking it from there. But anyway, let's get into the mailbag. We'll start with one for you. This was from Ken W. As a reminder, all of our questions from the mailbag come from the Discord, which is something that you can get into if you are a supporter or above. If you are subscribing to Sounder at Heart at a supporter level or above, I guess is the best way to say that. But anyway, Ken W. submitted this question. He says, what do you suppose are the minimum outputs the front office will need to see from Ruidíaz before opting to buy him out prior to the close of the summer transfer window? Could they get enough production from the rest of the team to decide to just keep him on the roster for the season, regardless of how much or little he's able to contribute?
So I think that decision probably happens earlier than the close of the summer transfer window, because if they buy him out, they're going to buy him out to bring somebody in, presumably. Right. So with that in mind, I looked at last year, and Jeremiah, you and I think both have been pretty consistent on the fact that the issue last year was not really Ruidíaz's production, because on a per 90 basis, he still put up pretty solid numbers. His non-penalty XG plus expected assists was like 0.56 per 90 or something like that, which, his first two seasons in MLS were absurd and were both over 0.7, I think. But the last last 3 seasons, that number is around the same level as the 2 prior. The issue was that he just wasn't on the field very much. He made 18 regular season appearances. He played off the bench in all 3 playoff games. But assuming that the point by which they will have made their decision is probably the opening of the summer window, which is early July, looking at the 2023 season, by that point, he had missed 7 of 22 regular season games to injury. He missed a couple more because of national team duty, and 1 more when he was out of the country due to the passing of his father, which is not an absence that I'm ever going to hold against him. He took that game. He, by all means, could have taken more games for that. That's a terrible thing to have to navigate, and there is another question that touches on that later on. But I imagine, unless his production absolutely drops off a cliff, the real thing they're going to be watching is, can he stay healthy and be available so that he is there to contribute off of the bench, or if Jordan Morris isn't available. I think if, they're going into July and he's again missed a third of all games to even possibly appear with injury, it's probably not going to be a good sign for Ruidíaz being with the Sounders going forward. If he is available and is also not performing, that's a question that they'll have to answer internally, but the track record shows that if he's consistently available, he ends up on the score sheet pretty consistently.
Yeah, I would agree with you. That I think it has more to do probably with how fit he's able to stay than it has to do with how much he's scoring. In part because if he's fit, you sort of assume a certain level of scoring. And if he's not, if he's fit, but he's not scoring, my assumption is that he's probably not playing a lot. And if he's not playing a lot, that's probably because Jordan is just doing that much better. And so you sort of, your thinking is still kind of the same. Like, look, we have Ruidíaz here as more of a insurance policy than as someone like, I don't think the Sounders are like in their preseason calculations, putting him down for X number of goals. I think they're hoping if he stays healthy, they just assume that there's going to be some level of production out of him. You don't necessarily judge. I don't think you're so much judging him by the goals as you are by his fitness. You sort of expect one fall the other. But anyway.
Yeah, I think if there's a benchmark stat, maybe it's minutes played.
Yeah.
And, just like 22 games available. If he's, played 500 minutes or fewer, probably he's not going to be around going forward for one reason or another. But that is just a guess.
Yeah. So you want to ask this one?
Yeah, that's this next one comes from Ben W00001. I really had to focus to get the right number of zeros.
Yeah, right.
And the question is, has the Sounders player acquisition and targeting strategy changed since we acquired Ladero and Ruidíaz? If you have to describe it, what is it, and what are the guiding principles?
There's been such a small sample of notable acquisitions, not necessarily since Ruidíaz, because they've made a bunch of signings since Ruidíaz. They signed João Paulo, they signed Yeimar, they signed, I think, Arriaga, who are all sort of like relatively established players that they had to pay a transfer fee for. Where we've seen where I think it's harder to harder to know what the acquisition strategy is in the Weibel era, and how much of that is Craig Weibel's philosophy and how much of that is an organizational philosophy, and how much of it is just a general, like, we're filling holes differently because we've had fewer holes. And so I think this year we will start to see whether or not there's a real change. Right now, it does look like, the last two big acquisitions they made were Leo Chu, which was way back in 2021. And now this one with Pedro de la Vega, who, between the two of them, that's about $10 million that they've spent. Both of these were on players who were 22 or younger. And if that's a trend, that's definitely different, because these are relatively unproven players compared to certainly Ladero and Ruidíaz, who were very much known commodities. They had certain attributes. They were very much about winning now, and they were not so much about thinking about potential sell-on fees or anything like that. They were players that, in fact, I think in both cases, they were players that the expectation was that they would never sell these players, that these players might leave, or they would eventually leave, but they would most likely leave in the manner that Ladero is leaving, which is at some point they just were no longer, the player that they needed them to be, and they allowed them to walk. And that's probably going to be the same case with Ruidíaz, and that's not a bad thing. It's just a different philosophy. Whereas with De La Vega and Chu, I think the expectation is that when they leave, it's the Sounders are selling them or moving them for other assets for one reason or another. And so that's certainly a change. I don't know how, it'll be interesting. Next year, they have two more designated player contracts that are going to be coming up. Albert Rusnak will be out of contract. Raúl Ruidíaz will be out of contract, assuming neither one of those players gets re-signed during the year. And then there's two senior DP spots that presumably you would want to fill with other senior DPs. And maybe we were off by a year by assuming that I thought this was going to be I thought we were going to see some much bigger changes this offseason than we ended up seeing. Maybe worked it up more in my head than like you look at it. There's not I don't know. I guess maybe one other player. I would have thought maybe they would bring in one other player, but anyway, I don't know. I guess that's my short answer is I don't know if we've seen it, but it does look like it's trending in that way.
I think just to your point that there was an expectation of a bigger winter window going into the offseason. We were much less sure that Albert Rusnak was still going to be around.
Right. That's a good point.
And the decision to keep him, one, seems to solidify their commitment to the way they played for much of last year.
Yes.
And limited how much change was going to need to be made.
And then we also thought there was a chance that they were going to buy out Ruidíaz. They clearly aren't, or at least there's no indication that they're planning on doing it. But yeah, I mean, in those ways, it's still pretty similar. You know, I like bringing back a reasonably productive player like Rusnak, who I think bought into what the team was doing and was a good, element inside the team. That's sort of like that's sticking to their old ways of doing things. And I don't think, and it's sort of like what's always been successful for them. Ruidíaz, this was a player who they have under contract for $3.2 million at least. And they weren't dying to just flush that money down the drain essentially and see if they can get something out of him. Again, I don't know that that's really surprising. We'll see. It's not neither one of those things were particularly aggressive. But I don't know that previous ownerships would have done anything, or previous leaderships would have done anything differently. All right, this one's from Dorcas. He says, I was talking to my father about the lineup for next year, and he was saying that after Raúl's father died, he never really looked the same. His wife being pregnant, by the way, I believe they just brought their daughter home from like 2 or 3 weeks in the hospital, so that was clearly not a totally straightforward pregnancy. And apparently moving his mother here made me wonder if this was also affecting his poor performance this past season.
I think I touched on this a little bit with answering the first question, but when he was on the field, I think there were definitely some opportunities that previous seasons of Raúl Ruidíaz he probably would have scored, but they're also the kind of goal that he has scored with seeming regularity, but they require something magnificent.
Mm-hmm.
To see him not quite pull those off, part of that is because his season was so stop-start between injuries and other absences. It's, it takes time to get into a rhythm and really fully shake off the rust when your season goes like that. I'm sure those various sorts of change and unsettling things happening in your life make performing in any other capacity much more difficult. I am sure anyone who has lost a loved one or experienced any kind of change, whether it's a positive or a negative, makes doing other things much more difficult. But I still think the injuries were a much bigger factor in how Ruidíaz performed this last season. And, he still found a way to get on the score sheet a fair amount for how little he was on the field. Although those did kind of come in bursts.
They did. I will say, if I'm to be a little bit more sympathetic, I guess, to this line of thinking, is his lack of fitness is maybe due to his distractedness off the field also. Like that is probably a contributing factor, right? Like if he's having a harder time doing the work outside of the field that he would have normally done, and even if it's these are things that are sometimes in the margins, right? Like that are the things that differentiate the best players from average players are not necessarily an underlying skill level. It's like how those extra reps that they're willing to take, and it's like these finer points. And I suppose it's possible that that's the stuff that was impacting him in ways that are harder to quantify. And so I wouldn't discount that possibility. And it's fair to point out that he had a rough, it was a tumultuous year off the field for him. And maybe that speaks to why the Sounders were willing to bring him back and sort of let him play out this contract, because they believe that's the case. That again, that might be a little bit too sympathetic of a viewpoint on it, but I wouldn't discount it entirely. Put it that way.
Yeah, I do think, just to add to that, sleep is a hugely important part of anybody's well-being just in general, but I think especially if you're trying to recover from an injury or an illness or whatever, if you aren't getting enough sleep, or your sleep is not of the necessary quality, it's going to be harder to recover. If you lost a parent, or having a tough time just performing in your job, like concerns about your wife's well-being while she's pregnant, the challenges of moving your mom to the country, and for all that it's probably really nice to have her here, relationships with parents are difficult, I think. Especially if you just lost your dad and you move your, that's all going to be hard. That's going to affect your sleep. All of these things are factors.
And it does, in his defense, or to the point, he does seem like someone who, family is a big part of his life. So he's probably more involved in a lot of these things than, some pro athletes might be. So,
yeah.
Watson's Counter wants to thank everyone for their patience, but now the wait is over. Located at 6420 24th Avenue Northwest in Ballard, they've reopened in a brand new location with the same bomb-ass coffee and the same dumbass vibes. You can still expect their classics like the gochujang fried chicken sandwich and Fruity Pebbles French toast, alongside their new soft serve program and their world-class coffee. Make sure to follow them on Instagram for all the latest and greatest.
Well, I think that answers that. So next question is for you. Comes from Everett Sounder. When do you think fans will be able to check out the new Longacres facility? Will there be a grand opening event?
My understanding is there will be a grand opening event. I don't know when. I know the Sounders are planning to start training there right around the middle of February, so February 13th, somewhere around there. I would imagine that there will be some sort of public event at the first day of training. I would imagine there will be sort of an open house event for season ticket holders outside of that event, where they would give tours. You can go down there now and look at the land. I was there. The last time I was there was for the end of season press conference. We were only on the third floor, which is technically not a floor the Sounders are going to occupy once they are fully moved in, but they're up there now, and it's a functional office space. But I did get a tour of the training floor, but it's like empty. These were they're literally like hanging drywall and things like that. But it will be a nice facility, I think. But I don't know when fans will get to look at it. But you can rest assured that they are going to make it very accessible. Maybe not quite as accessible as Starfire was, but in a counterintuitive way, even by making it will be less accessible, but there might be more people visiting it because it'll be more accommodating. It'll be more of a destination, I think, that fans want to visit.
Right. The parts that you will be able to visit will be much more Sounders focused
than
you can go to Starfire, because you could be in an indoor soccer league that plays there. Or your kid could play there.
Right. Yes.
Access for Sounders things is much more limited at Starfighter.
Right. And it's basically watching them train, whereas they'll have a little bit more infrastructure around everything. This is from Boomstick 315. Starting next year, according to the CBA, 25% of all media right revenue over a certain threshold will be going straight into the salary cap on top of the already scheduled increases. Between the huge Apple deal and any potential increase in media revenue sharing due to Messi, this could presumably be a substantial amount of money. Does that affect how owners are thinking when it comes to the lack of roster changes, i.e., is there any huge messy bump we're already on the hook to put 25% into the squads? So I guess what he's asking from your perspective is, did we not see a big bump this year because they are already like preparing themselves for a big bump next year?
Maybe. I think the lack of roster moves is probably because they really like their roster more than anything else.
Well, I think he's talking more at a league level.
On a league level.
Yeah.
Maybe. I think
I hadn't really thought of it this way myself, but it's an interesting possibility.
It is. I think I'd have to go and look, but I feel like the winter window isn't the busiest, even for the fact that it's the MLS off season. It's just not the ideal time to make moves by and large.
Yeah.
I think, the fact that maybe you would expect more movement ahead of an Olympic year, but I think there's also some reticence from players who could go to the Olympics to move ahead of the Olympics unless they like really need to move away to get minutes. The salary stuff might be a factor, but I imagine it's a much smaller one than.
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to think of it this way: is like there was a lot of expectation this year that people had that MLS was going to add a fourth designated player or even a fifth designated player, or they were going to, like I had heard that one of the things that they were thinking about doing was unlocking all the U22 spots for every team, regardless of who their DPs were. And, those were all changes they certainly could have made, and they wouldn't have been tectonic changes. But at the same time, I on some level, like when it comes to fourth DPs or fifth DPs or whatever, I think that it was probably a prudent decision not to just add one high salaried player to the roster. If what your goal is to do is to improve the overall quality of play, what we need to do there is increase the overall flexibility in spending. And those are not necessarily things that you want to be done in like big one fell swoop things, because what the league is understandably reticent to do is create a system where the existing players are where you're giving all this new money to just the existing players, because that doesn't necessarily raise the level of the competition. And so I don't know. I guess I don't want to. I'm not trying to run interference for the owners. I would have liked there to be more aggressive investment too, but it's possible that part of the reason they're like, this is an interesting theory that I had not really considered, that basically they didn't want to dump a bunch of money into the rosters, a bunch of new money into the rosters this year, because they were going to be forced to do it next year anyway. And then you start, maybe overspending. I don't know. They were not very aggressive. I was much more disappointed about the US Open Cup thing and the way that whole thing played out, but we don't need to get into that right now.
Yeah. All right. The next question comes from Klaxon5. At what point should we worry if the PDLV deal isn't done? Pedro de la Vega, if that acronym was not one folks were familiar with. Everyone seems confident, and it isn't unusual for deals to drag on, but when should we start to worry that it will fall through?
So I'll note that this question came in like 4 days ago. So it was, I believe, before the Fabrizio Romano report, where he effectively said the deal is done. And if you don't know, Fabrizio Romano is probably the most connected person when it comes to like transfer news in the world. And that he's even deigning to cover MLS these days feels in a weird way like a win. But the reports out of Argentina are that it's done. I have not been able to confirm it like in a way that I would feel comfortable reporting, but I've gotten a lot of indications that the deal is basically done. No one, let's put it this way, no one is running around saying that report is wrong, and you should be really careful about what you're saying. And that's oftentimes what happens if we get out over our skis. So my expectation is that it's done. That said, if we get through the next week and there's still been no announcement, I would definitely wonder why that is. And I would be a little worried that something happened that has undermined it. So yeah, I mean, if we're sitting here next Friday and we still don't have an official announcement, I'd say it's fair to worry. I don't know. I won't be like, I don't have a crystal ball to say that there's definitely going to be something wrong, but it would strike me as odd because if the Sounders, my expectation is that the Sounders want to get this done before they leave to Spain, because they're going to want to bring De La Vega with them, and they're not going to bring him with them unless he's under contract. And they sort of got a little bit of a break here when he had to leave the Argentina U23 camp with some sort of injury. I've been told that the injury is not serious and that their expectation is that he will be able to start training again in like a week. So I don't know. It could be like they're just waiting to announce it until he's like in market and they can do a whole press conference and blow this thing out, because it is a big expenditure and they probably want to make the most of like promoting it. I don't know. What's your vibe? Do you like, when do you get worried, Tim? When I tell you, Tim?
Yeah, probably. I think next week, end of next week is probably a good time. It's not unnotable that, like, as we said at the top, they've made like 4 player announcements that we sort of knew had happened weeks ago.
Right.
And were much less complicated than internationals. Like, none of those deals involved an ITC or anything, or a transfer fee to a foreign club and negotiating sell-on fees.
Right.
I guess the Raúl Ruidíaz deal involves some sell-on percentage with New York City, but still a much more straightforward deal. I think, the next week should be a time that we would expect to hear about it, I think.
Yeah, that's if we're sitting here again, like if we're sitting here next Friday and there's still questions as to why it'll be, I'm not going to tell anyone to not be like, none of these things are all oftentimes complicated. And it does look like, if I'm reading between the lines, it looks like to me what they were haggling over is sell-on percentage. And that's sort of like what dragged this thing out on as long as it's gone. But yeah, if it's still going, that's definitely, it's not ideal. All right. This is from Eric NW. He says, Jordan did both of his ACLs. JP did his. Both came back very strong, presumably in part based on recovery training programs specified by the Sounders. Does this experience give them any advantage over clubs that might be less willing to sign guys coming back from ACL injury, like a Pedro de la Vega or a Nathan?
Maybe. Having a team staff and medical staff who are familiar with the possible progression and how bodies are going to respond to different things over the course of that recovery probably helps. That said, there are best practices, but every injury is different slightly. Every player's body is different, and the exact nature of the tear or strain or whatever is different. Pedro de la Vega's ACL was more than a season ago. I imagine that wasn't that much of a factor for them, but maybe all of the experience with Raúl Ruidíaz's soft tissue injuries made them feel more comfortable navigating De La Vega's apparent hamstring struggles recently. I think that most professional teams feel pretty confident of being able to navigate a player who has returned from an injury. I don't know that that's unique to the Sounders.
I don't know if it's unique to the Sounders. I will say that it is easy to sort of take for granted, though, that players come back similar to the player they were on ACL injuries. Like you hear anecdotally about plenty of players who just were never the same after doing their ACL. I will say one thing I would imagine gave the Sounders a little bit more confidence in De La Vega is that they do have a fair amount of experience with this, like they said. And, he's going to be a year removed now from his injury. He's already played a full season. That's usually the timeline where you start to see players get back to their normal selves. And so, that might give them some confidence that De La Vega is poised for sort of like a breakout campaign, as opposed to Nathan. I would think their expectations are going to be a little bit lower as for the same reason, although defenders, you have a different perspective on that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's not outside the question. I would say maybe it gave them a little bit more confidence to sign these guys. I don't know that the players look at the Sounders as like, oh, they did a really good job with ACLs, so that's where I want to go.
Yeah. Let's see. So the next one is another one from Ken W. What are the chances First and Goal decides to revisit the grass versus turf decision and maybe opts for something other than turf?
My understanding is literally right now, new surface is being laid down at Lumen Field, and I think we would have heard if it wasn't field turf. Everything I'm hearing is that they are putting in field turf. I suppose it's possible that next year they might have a change of heart and say we should put in grass. And I suppose it's possible that the prospects of the Club World Cup skipping Lumen Field, I suppose it's possible that in the negotiations over the Club World Cup, that the Sounders or FIFA or whoever else are able to appeal to First and Goal and say, like, look, they're not going to give us the Club World Cup unless we put in real grass. Let's just bite the bullet, do it a year early, put it in now, and we'll just deal with that as it's. I don't want to say that's not outside the realm of possibility, but at the same time, the only reason First and Goal, I think, is agreeing to put in grass for the World Cup is because I think that it's in the charter. Like they have the World Cup is actually carved out in the charter that built Lumen Field, and there is no carve out for the Club World Cup in that, so they don't have to. And I don't know. I guess unless there's a change of heart with the Seahawks and First and Goal, it's not going to happen. And I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, but I suppose there is a possibility that I don't want to say that it's a 0% chance. I'm not expecting it. I would love to be wrong. I hope that it can't really be overstated how big of a miss it would be that the Club World Cup is going to be played in the United States, that it's going to be played, that the Sounders are going to be in it. It quite literally might be a once in a lifetime opportunity to see the Sounders host a Club World Cup game against a real opponent. We're talking about like the biggest clubs in the world potentially playing an actual meaningful home game. Like that's a huge opportunity, huge missed opportunity if they don't get the Club World Cup, and it would be a real shame for them not to get it. And so maybe that case can be made and it will be compelling. And from what I can tell, the Sounders just were not really interested in going through the hassle of hosting the Copa America. So I don't necessarily know that may have been a cast has died kind of situation. I do think that there's hope that they're going to keep the grass for the 27 Women's World Cup if they can get that. But yeah, I don't know. I think that answers it.
Maybe Pete Carroll was just a really big turf guy.
Right.
Now that he's sort of out of the paint, they can.
Yeah, exactly.
Grass.
There you go.
Maybe they'll bring in a pro grass.
A coach that, maybe that's who knows? That's more realistic. That might be like, honestly, that I could see that swaying the decision-making process more likely is like whoever they bring in as the new Seahawks coach says, I'm only going to come there if we have grass.
That felt more real the farther I got into it.
Right. Yeah. All right. This is from Chico Flores. He says, what are the chances that Ozzy signs a one-day contract to retire as a Sounder? I haven't read too much about this, but it seems only right for him to come home.
I have no sense of this, but the Sounders have never done it. And I'm not, maybe a couple players from other MLS teams who have done it, but I don't think that this is really like a thing that happens in MLS. Maybe there is something in the somewhat Byzantine nature of MLS salary and cap construction that makes it less likely, but other professional American leagues do not have meaningfully less Byzantine roster rules, and other leagues seem to have this happen at least somewhat regularly. If you were going to do it for somebody, Ozzy is a good case for it, but I just don't know how likely that actually is.
I don't know how likely it is. It would be cool, but there's also nothing that stops them from doing some, like the 50th anniversary is coming up. You got to imagine that Ozzy Alonso will be involved in some way. I don't particularly care if it's a ceremonial one-day contract or it's a more meaningful, like I would much rather see him honored at a pregame ceremony or incorporated into some sort of broader celebration. I've never quite understood the point of the one-day contract. Sure, I wouldn't mind it, but I would not put that at the. I would like to think there's plenty of other ways to honor him that don't involve that.
I imagine the one-day contract thing is probably more of a deal for like Major League Baseball, where after you've retired and you get enshrined in the Hall of Fame, you get enshrined with the hat or insignia of one of the teams that you represented. And so that, signing a one-day contract to retire with, the Mariners or whatever is sort of like a nod to when I enter the hall, I will enter the hall as a member of this team because I didn't do the same for one of the other teams I played for. I don't really think that's how it works for the soccer hall. Like the Soccer Hall of Fame just isn't as much of a big deal as the Baseball Hall of Fame. But yeah, I am positive that he will be part of 50th anniversary celebrations. The opening of Longacres presents them the opportunity to do some sort of like a Hall of Heroes sort of thing, and Ozzy can be the first member of that. But I wouldn't expect to see a ceremonial one-day contract.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Europe.
So the next one is from Quimberly23. With her loan move reportedly having a loan fee as well as a transfer associated, how can each amount be utilized by the Sounders organization?
So I don't know for certain that the first team Sounders don't stand to benefit from this directly, but my suspicion is that they don't. And the loan fee is probably low enough that it doesn't make a huge difference. My understanding is that if Chivas exercise the purchase option, it's only like $100,000, which again is not a significant amount that would affect the first team. But this is all money that can be cycled back into Defiance. The Sounders, the Defiance have an operating budget. The Sounders have an operating budget. Everything that they bring in, every revenue stream they bring in has some impact. But I really don't think this is about the financial impact. This is more about a proof of concept of showing we can develop players, we can move them into bigger leagues, we can move them into other opportunities, and sort of laying the groundwork for, if the MLS Next Pro, if you are able to routinely sell players from MLS Next Pro, this price is not super, is not like itself the proof of concept. But if you can show that you can illustrate that the MLS Next Pro is a high enough level that we can produce players here and then move them on and they can be successful elsewhere, that will eventually raise the level there. And that's sort of, that's another revenue stream for the Sounders. That's something that can be kicked back into the first team potentially. And so I think you sort of have to look at it more of a long, like a wide view of what does this mean in the big picture, and less about what does it mean for, like, what did the Sounders stand to gain specifically by this move? And it's not much is the answer, but it sort of potentially has this wider aperture where you're seeing, the Defiance as a tool that's not just about producing players for the first team. It's about producing, transfer fees going elsewhere.
Right. I think, to your point, it is best viewed holistically, and the more the Sounders organization in its entirety develops professionals and is able to move them on to other and bigger leagues, the better the broad perception of the Sounders organization is.
Right.
The easier it becomes to sell players in general, whether that's homegrown or a Pedro de la Vega who comes here as a 22-year-old and, entering that transfer market more broadly is a positive step.
Exactly. All right. This is from Eric, and he says, I regularly hear the MLS talking heads confidently dismiss Josh Atencio as having, quote, a low ceiling. Is this a shared opinion among talent scouts? Is it fair/reasonable?
Maybe I'm somewhat out of the loop, but I am not terribly familiar with MLS talking heads describing Josh Atencio as having a low ceiling. I think the broad perception seems to be that, he's been a youth national team prospect. He's getting his second look with the potential Olympic age group. He is a consistent performer for one of the best MLS teams in the league, and seems like he's taken steps progressively since he first started getting MLS playing time. I happen to be of the belief that if he continues to grow and the things that he shows flashes of makes consistent parts of his game, he certainly could be an at least elite MLS midfielder, which is a pretty high bar to reach. I feel like that's not a particularly unpopular opinion, but he's not the flashiest player. He doesn't score a ton of goals or get a ton of assists. Those are the things that get the most attention, compared to other, some of the younger, like, MLS players who play in similar roles. There are guys who do get more goals and assists. I think Benji Kramashi or Noel Buck, and I'm sure that I got Kramashi's name wrong. Those guys show up on the score sheet. They're a little bit younger. They have international interest. Yeah, maybe they have higher ceilings. Ultimately, I don't know how much that really matters.
Yeah, I would say that the low ceiling statement, I think, is more in relation to relative to some of the other Sounders prospects like a Reed Baker Whiting or Obed Vargas. And I think it's more in the perception that this is like Atencio looks like a player who could spend his whole career in MLS, be a very good MLS player, maybe even being an outstanding MLS player, but you hear less chatter about him moving to Europe. Whereas, Obed Vargas, Reed Baker Whiting, to name two, are players who are constantly talked about as potentially being sold to European teams. And so maybe in that way, he is a relative low ceiling player. But I think his ceiling is, I would not be at all surprised to see him make all-star teams or to see him be in a contender for MLS Best 11. I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, to see him moving to Europe. So I don't know. I think he hasn't had as much hype around him. He is now 21 years old. He only recently he was really late in the season where he was starting enough to be seen by players that or fans that weren't, or people that weren't watching the Sounders on an every week basis. So these are all contributing factors. I wouldn't read too much into it. I think he's a player who can be extremely, extremely good.
Yeah, I think, one last note on that is just that some of it is just the nature of Obed Vargas broke into the first team as a 15, 16-year-old. Like, guys who are getting there, even if they're not playing as much as he has at a younger age, are going to be talked about more. It is just sort of the nature of these things.
Yeah.
So I think last question from Polsbo Sounder. Any word on the potential kit launch day and new merch launch? Thanks.
You might actually have more insight into the merch launch. I would say with the kit launch, this has become pretty standard fare at this point. About a week before the season opens, the Sounders break out their new kit. All indications that I've heard are that it's going to be green. I don't know about the shorts. I will say that Jordan Morris appeared to be wearing shorts that matched his training top at the media day yesterday. And logic would suggest that if he was wearing blue shorts, that they were probably to be paired with the primary jersey. And that would be an interesting look. I am totally speculating that they might be paired with the new look. I would imagine leaks will come out before anything else. So that'll be, like, I know last year, one of the worst kept secrets was that the Sounders new jersey was going to be Bruce Lee inspired. Although I don't think any actual leaks came out too far before it. Sounders, for whatever reason, have been able to keep a pretty tight lid on kit leaks. There was something on Footy headlines that I believe was a complete artist rendition of, based on the color they were told that it was going to be, which is basically just the Pantone of their new Pantone, as best I can tell. So I don't know, but I wouldn't read. So I don't know. I guess a week before the season is the answer on the jersey. As far as when they're going to drop new merch, I don't know. I have no idea. Do you have any insight into that?
Not really. I would expect and maybe they'll wait until, the team moves into Longacres fully, which I think is happening sometime next month after they get back from Spain. 50th anniversary related stuff probably is going to be the next
push
collection.
Yeah.
From their merch. Beyond that, I don't have any insight on a timeline or what's going to be involved. I'm sure that the merch that's been released so far is not all there's going to be, but probably closer to, there'll be new kit tie-in stuff and all sorts of things, but no idea when that's going to come out.
Yeah. Well, I will say something I just thought about. I don't think there's a pro shop at the new at Longacres, which seems like a little bit of a potential missed opportunity. But there'll be all kinds of interesting stuff. I guess there's lots of other buildings that could still be utilized in sort of retail-y type of ways. So maybe I shouldn't speak too authoritatively on that. That said, thanks for hanging out, Tim. Good having you on here.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and just a reminder to everyone, we are sponsored by Full Pool Wines right now. If you are interested in becoming a sponsor, please reach out. We are always looking for new sponsors. This was a free episode of the Mailbag episode, but going forward, our plan is again to have these behind the paywall. So if you like these Mailbag episodes, I would highly recommend becoming a subscriber. Any subscriber can get access to our private RSS feed. But if you want to ask questions, you have to be in our Discord, and to be on our Discord, you have to be a subscriber at the supporter level or above. That's the $74 a year level. So there's my little PBS plug type thing. I am Jeremiah Shan, signing off for Tim Foss. This is No Saudietes, and we will catch you next time.
We love you. Let's win another one.